Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, on a collision course, the U.S. and China beef up their militaries in the Pacific.
I think every year we are getting even closer to a conflict between the U.S. and China.
But as the tensions ratchet up, how are local communities around U.S. military bases affected? I'm Natasha del Toro, and this is The Take.
We're here in Hawaii, where the U.S. Army is training troops in jungle combat. These are skills that the military says are critical to counter China in the Pacific.
That's Dan Ming, a correspondent for Evident Media. He recently embedded with the U.S. military in Japan, Guam, and Hawaii to show how it's using those places as a staging ground for potential conflict with China. The documentary is called Arming the Pacific. But the U.S. military's increased presence in the Pacific has an impact on the local communities around it, and some of them are pushing back.
With this documentary, I wanted viewers to see the consequences of all of this talk about war between the U.S. and China and who would be most affected.
I caught up with Dan to learn more about that and why the U.S. militarization of the region matters right now. All right, Dan Ming, it's so nice to have you here. You've made this great film. It's called Arming the Pacific, and the reporting for this took you to military bases in Japan, Hawaii, and Guam, where you were embedded with soldiers and even saw them participate in something that's called jungle school. That's definitely not something that I'd ever heard of before. What is jungle school, and what was it like to get access to it?
So Jungle School is an Army training program that's designed to make soldiers more familiar with tropical landscapes without having much access to technology. And the whole program was designed as a way for the military to become more familiar with these environments that are more like Vietnam, more reminiscent of the Vietnam War than maybe Iraq or Afghanistan, or you have desert environments. The military has actually given a lot of access to journalists for Jungle School over the years. I think they're very eager to show off how they're preparing for a war with China. That's part of the strategy as well. So we embedded with these soldiers for 3 days as they went through this training course. They were sleeping in the jungle, sleeping in tents. They were navigating without any technology. They were using just a compass and a map, trudging through rivers, through mud, through dense forests, and really learning how to operate in this environment.
And if there was a conflict with China, I mean, is this the kind of combat that we would be likely to see?
This is one of the ways that the military envisions it happening, and it's more based on a World War II tactic of island hopping, where the military would advance along different Pacific islands in order to get closer to the battlefield. I think largely you would imagine an air war in a conflict between the U.S. and China.
Right.
But each division is sort of eager to prove what they're doing to be ready for that battle. And this is how the Army is showing that it would be useful in that confrontation.
Now, let's talk about sort of like the meat and potatoes. Your documentary really centers around the idea that the U.S. is on this collision course with China over Taiwan. And the U.S. has had this longstanding policy of so-called strategic ambiguity over Taiwan, which you talk about in the film. This means not fully committing to defending the island against a Chinese invasion, but also not really ruling it out. Then again, just a few weeks ago, the Washington Post published a secret memo from the Pentagon saying that defending Taiwan from a Chinese takeover is a top military priority. So from what you saw in your reporting and the military personnel that you talked to, how close do you think that we actually are to a conflict over this issue?
I think every year we are getting even closer to a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. There's a lot of uncertainty about, number one, how China would do this, whether it be an economic blockade or a full-on military invasion. And then number two, about how the U.S. would respond. And the U.S., as you mentioned, has had this program of strategic ambiguity for decades. And that's designed to give some uncertainty about how the military would respond, whether it would come to Taiwan's defense to make that less appealing for China to invade Taiwan.
How big are the stakes here? I mean, what makes this moment particularly urgent?
I mean, the stakes would be huge. It would be two nuclear armed powers, the US and China, in a direct military confrontation. And, there's a concern that the two countries could stumble into war, that perhaps an action in the region could be misinterpreted by the other, and that could lead to a military response, which should get a military counter response. So there's a lot of concern that there could be an accidental war, even like a small scale localized breakout of conflict in the region. And then the concern is that could escalate even further.
And for people who aren't really up on the geopolitics of this region, why is defending Taiwan something that would be important to the United States?
I mean, that itself is highly debated in foreign policy circles in the US. Those who believe that Taiwan should be defended would say that it's important for US allies in the region to see that the US would defend Taiwan, and that if the US did not defend Taiwan, that American allies in the Asia Pacific would gravitate towards China. If China were to invade Taiwan and the US didn't defend it, there could be huge economic consequences for the United States. Taiwan, as we know, is a huge producer of semiconductors, which are used in electronics. But the other side would say that a direct military confrontation with China over Taiwan isn't worth it, that Taiwan is not a US territory. And I think it's important to remember that the US does not actually have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan as a concession to China.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think this is really about Taiwan, or is this more about the US exerting influence in the region?
I mean, definitely the latter. The US has long had a position that it wants to maintain dominance in the Asia-Pacific region, and China has been challenging that a lot in the last decade.
And I know that you filmed a lot of this before last year's U.S. election. How much do you think this story has changed since Donald Trump came back into power? I mean, with the trade wars and tariffs that we're now seeing, he also said on the campaign trail that Taiwan should be paying the United States for protection.
During his campaign trail, President Trump said Taiwan should pay more to be defended by the U.S. And now he dodges the questions when asked if his administration would allow China to take Taiwan by force.
I mean, we know that at the end of the day, Donald Trump is very unpredictable. And how does that all play into the U.S. militarization in the Pacific?
So militarization of the Pacific has largely stayed on the same course it was under Biden, under Trump's first term, and under Obama. The second Trump administration has not made any dramatic shifts in that policy. Mm-hmm. There are several incidents recently that have raised concern about the potential for this to escalate. One, the Trump administration's sort of abandoning of Ukraine has made Taiwan very concerned that they would not defend it if China were to invade. The State Department's website recently dropped the phrase from its Taiwan fact sheet. The quote, "We do not support Taiwan independence," was taken off the State Department's website. So that's another conflicting signal. China was very upset about that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the trade war between the US and China just raises the temperature and sort of deteriorates diplomatic relations between the two countries. So there are a lot of conflicting things happening. At the end of the day, you're right. We don't know what Trump would do. And he does take a very transactional view of these kind of arrangements. So it's not clear whether or not he would come to Taiwan's defense.
More with Dan after the break. Dan, I want to shift and talk about the cost and the burden for the local communities that are hosting these U.S. military bases. You spent time in Okinawa, Japan, which famously has had a U.S. military presence for a long time. But there've also been
since the Second World War, yeah.
Since the Second World War, right. So many, many decades. And there have also been serious problems with this presence, including incidents of sexual violence perpetrated by U.S. soldiers against the local population, helicopter crashes, even murder.
Negative views of the U.S. military troops on the island heightened after an American civilian worker was arrested in connection to a local woman who was raped and murdered in May.
A U.S. military helicopter crashed Wednesday. It was trying to land on a ship off the coast of Okinawa, Japan.
Another case involving sexual assault, this time on Christmas Eve. A Japanese minor taken to the home of a 25-year-old U.S. senior airman and allegedly assaulted.
Okinawans have been trying to get the U.S. to leave for decades. You know, I know that negotiations started on this issue in 1995 after a very sort of infamous case of the rape of a 12-year-old girl by 3 servicemen in Okinawa. That was 30 years ago, and yet the redeployment of U.S. Marines there has only just started to happen to some extent. You attended a protest against the U.S. military while you were there. Is the fact that the U.S. is finally starting to leave seen as a victory of people power?
No, I would say that Okinawans don't see this as a victory. It's a very small contingent that's leaving. It's the closure of the Marine Corps base, Futenma Marine Corps base in Okinawa, but there are still dozens of other bases around Japan. There are 54,000 U.S. military personnel in Japan, most of them in Okinawa. And this is just one small segment that's leaving as a concession to Japan and after these 30 years of protests since that horrible case of sexual violence that you mentioned.
And what were people there on the ground, telling you at the protest?
So people were very interested in the fact that I was there from an American outlet. And one protester said, I want people in the U.S. to see this and understand what we're living with and ask themselves if they would accept this kind of thing happening.
There's a military base right in the middle of the town where I live. Helicopter crashes are commonplace. I don't think conditions like these would be tolerated in the U.S.
Okinawa is very urbanized, and the military bases are sort of everywhere you look. If you drive down the road, if you circle the main island, you'll encounter a base every 5 or 10 minutes. Helicopter crashes, as you mentioned, are commonplace. One recently into an elementary school. Service members often die in these crashes. Mm-hmm. And there are continuing cases of sexual violence, and there have been several high-profile cases of murder committed by U.S. service members and military base workers. So the Okinawans really wanted an American audience to understand what was happening and understand that they can't tolerate this.
So, Dan, one of the places that you went to that I'm particularly fascinated by is Guam. This is where the U.S. military presence it's increasing now as Marines who were stationed in Japan are starting to now move over to Guam. For people who don't know about Guam, this is a tiny little territory in the Pacific. I think it's like 166,000 people. I mean, it's very small, acquired by the U.S. in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War, just like Puerto Rico, which is where my family comes from. And it's essentially a colony. The U.S. sees it as a strategic location. It's a key base. Its military has developed a new missile defense system there. And Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was just in Guam last month, reiterating its importance to the U.S.
These islands are the tip of America's spear in the Pacific. Guam and CNMI, vital parts of America and central to our defense mission.
The locals there, they are U.S. citizens, even though they can't vote for president. They have a non-voting member of Congress, so they don't really have a whole lot of say of what's going on on the island. And now they're essentially in the firing line, both in terms of the base's training activities and if the bases in Guam were ever attacked. I'm curious, what did activists there tell you about how they feel about the way Guam is being used by the U.S. military?
I mean, activists in Guam are very resentful about how the U.S. military has expanded on the island over the year. The military now controls 30% of the land on Guam, and it's a very small island, as you mentioned. The biggest concern is an existential one. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a prominent DC think tank, runs these war game scenarios of a US-China conflict over Taiwan. And in every iteration of these war games, China strikes Guam first. And people in Guam are very aware of that. And the activists told me they don't want any part in this conflict that Guamanians, Chamorro people, the indigenous population, have nothing to do with.
So they could essentially get wiped off the map if there's like a nuclear weapon that is directed at them. I mean, and this is not even, it's not their war.
Exactly. The island is hugely important to the U.S. military for its location, for its proximity to China. But Guamanians say, we have no conflict with China personally. It's the U.S. that does.
And at the same time, I understand that the military is, the main employer on the island of Guam. So it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of how people feel. On one hand, they do have these impacts environmentally, obviously fears of there being a conflict. And at the same time, this is a main employer on the island. But then there are these activists that you spoke to, like Melvin Juan Patborja, who wants to see Guam's relationship to the U.S. change, potentially through becoming independent or at least getting statehood.
All of those options are absolutely viable, but they're only viable if remaining a territory is off the table. Why would they honor any of those statuses when they could have it all right now?
Moving forward, how do you see Guam's relationship with the U.S. and the military presence there playing out?
I mean, Guam has officially, as part of its government, what's called a Commission on Decolonization, which is tasked with holding a referendum to decide a new status for the territory. And the three options that they're presenting are independence, statehood, or something that's called a Compact of Free Association, which is a relationship like the Marshall Islands or Palau have with the United States military, where the military can be there and citizens of the island have special visas that they can get to work in the U.S. It's hard to imagine the United States ever recognizing the outcome of such a vote. And there's been a lot of battles over who could even vote in this kind of referendum, whether it could be limited to just the indigenous Chamorro population of Guam. So there is an official stance in Guam that the relationship needs to change, but the military is so entrenched and the United States has so much power over Guam that it's hard to imagine anything eventually actually changing.
Mm-hmm. And again, some of these points that you are mentioning remind me quite a bit of the U.S. military presence that was in Puerto Rico as well. The Navy left Puerto Rico because there was a huge fight over environmental damage that was going on there and just disruption to the local population. And again, Puerto Rico is also, a territory of the United States. So the military has an outsized political role, and there's a commission that's looking to change the status of Guam through a referendum. But do you think that the U.S. would actually recognize any outcome from that referendum? Because in Puerto Rico, they haven't.
No, I don't think that the U.S. would recognize the outcome of that referendum. I mean, the U.S. is not interested in changing the relationship with Guam because the way it is right now, the U.S. can do whatever they want. The military can do whatever they want on Guam, essentially, without having to seek permission, as they would in other countries like Japan or South Korea or the Philippines.
And again, that's because they don't have self-determination, they're self-governance. So, I guess the question then is, because they have so much to lose, the people of Guam, and they don't have a lot of say over what happens to them, how do people in Guam live with the sort of looming threat every day of a potential conflict?
I mean, they live with it. I mean, some choose to oppose the military. Antonio Sablan, who I interviewed, is a landowner. He has this beautiful waterfront property that's right near the new Marine Corps base. And for decades, the military has limited what he can do with his land because of its proximity to Department of Defense territory. And now there are going to be even further restrictions with the firing range that they're building just above his property and the new missile defense program. So when there's a missile test, he won't be allowed anywhere near his land. And he made the point to me that all of this is happening because the Marines are getting kicked out of Okinawa. And why should Guam have to bear the burden now? And he asked, very bluntly,
who gets killed first if there should be a war? Absolutely our people, the island of Guam. The question is, when do I die? When do I get powderized?
Others think that there's a need to further fortify Guam because of that threat of a potential conflict. The military is proposing a new missile defense system. They call it a 360-degree missile defense system for Guam. And there is support for that on the island. You have to remember that in addition to the resistance to the military, there's also a lot of people who support the military presence on the island because in World War II, the Japanese occupied Guam, and that was a very brutal occupation. But the U.S. military took Guam back, and they refer to that as Liberation Day.
Liberation Day festivities will return this year with a parade, floats, food trucks, loud music, fireworks, and dozens of families camping, dancing, and even barbecuing, celebrating 78 years of being free from the Japanese occupation.
So at that time, the American military were seen as the liberators of the Chamorro people. And every day they celebrate this holiday, Liberation Day. And Guam has one of the highest rates of recruitment in the United States for the U.S. military.
Dan, when you were exploring making this documentary, what were you really hoping to leave people with?
With this documentary, I wanted viewers to see the communities that would be on the front lines of a conflict between the U.S. and China. And it's largely not people on the U.S. mainland. It's those who live near military bases in the Asia-Pacific region. And especially for an American audience, I thought it was important to see the consequences of all of this talk about war between the U.S. and China and who would be most affected.
Great. Well, we thank you for making this film. I think it's really, really important. And obviously, we're going to have to keep an eye on what sort of escalation there is now between the U.S. and China. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this one, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you're going to find all of our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.